This podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not intended to replace therapeutic services of any kind. Please refer to the list of references provided if you need support. Welcome, everyone, to another Sessions with Sara Cate and Ashley. I am Sara Cate.
I'm Ashley.
And today we are going to be talking about boundaries. When we were kind of planning and mapping out what sessions we were going to cover and what conversations we wanted to have, we thought boundaries was a really important conversation to have following up our last session, which was about self-abandonment, because oftentimes a lack of boundaries leads to the act of self-abandonment. If we aren't boundaried enough with our friends, family, communities, partner, whatever it might be, our time, our energy, if we're not boundaried enough with those things, we can often self-sacrifice or step away from what we actually need, how we need it, when we need it. And so these conversations kind of go hand in hand. And then even to deepen that a little bit more, today's conversation is kind of a two-part in some ways, where we're going to talk about establishing healthy boundaries, understanding what those might even be, who it's appropriate to have boundaries with, and why we need them in situations that maybe otherwise we would think we didn't. But how then boundaries, if they become too rigid, can ultimately be harmful to yourself or to somebody else. And so establishing kind of the twofold conversation of like, yes, we need them. And we also need to be very aware of how those are a part of a collective and contribute to maybe somebody else's needs or impact somebody else's needs as well. And so learning maybe that balance or that dance of that fine line where, I kind of think when Ashley was saying that's kind of what she wanted to touch on, I was kind of thinking of like, it's hard with like mother-child, like I'm thinking about the mother-child dynamic where it's like, if a mother's boundaries are too strong, how is that impacting the child? But if a mother's boundaries are too weak, how is that impacting the child? Right. Yeah. And like, that's such a delicate relationship where you really have to navigate that, because often mothers forgo all of their needs and just completely and utterly remove any boundary, but then also not having, having too strong of boundaries with a child could lead to a lack of attunement to the child's needs. So, and that's just a generalized conversation. I'm big supporter of moms. This isn't about mom shaming in any way, shape, or form, but that was a kind of an analogy for the greater conversation.
It's an example of how this could go both ways, like super supportive boundaries and for both people, and how one side could have a really unhealthy boundary for them, but also then the other person involved in the relationship.
Totally.
Yeah. So it's just an example of how that can play out.
Yeah. That, and then we get into those muddy waters of codependence and that kind of thing, or too strong of independence and lack of connection. So, there's a lot. There's a lot sitting in all of this, to be quite honest. And I want to also just kind of throw this out there that boundaries and learning what your boundaries are is a practiced skill.
Yeah.
It is something that over time has to be learned, renegotiated, and then oftentimes they become, I always say the difference when I was teaching yoga, I would say there's a very strong difference between borders and boundaries. Borders are immovable structures. They are stuck there. They are rigid. That is for people who should not be a part of your life. Perhaps, it was a perpetrator or someone who really did massive harm and they no longer are a part of your world. And then there's boundaries, right? When you're developing a new relationship, you have your boundaries, and as trust builds, you can adjust those boundaries. They can become more movable structures, and you can renegotiate those over time. But it is a very practiced and constantly being explored, I would say.
Yeah,
kind of skilled.
Yes.
Even for me, after years of being a therapist and years of doing my own therapy, I still have to learn how to practice setting boundaries. It definitely becomes sometimes more difficult than I want it to be. And then sometimes I am very clear and I'm like,
Yeah.
nope, this is the boundary that I need to set. So it's interesting to see, and I grew up kind of with a lack of boundaries in a lot of ways around my time and energy. And,
Yeah.
I grew up in kind of a structure where it was like you give, you give, you give, you give, you give. That's how we show love. That's how we know we have worth and value, is how much we externally focus. Which then I think as an adult, it took me a really long time to come home to myself and like recognize that like my worth and value is not in hyperextending and being completely and utterly exhausted and
Yeah.
depleted.
Yeah. And I think, so like we already said, this is kind of like a lifelong journey. You're kind of learning this as you go, because you're never in the same stage of life twice, right? You're constantly growing. Hopefully the goal is to like continue to grow and not stay super stagnant. And so if that's the case, you are going to have to be renegotiating your boundaries with yourself and with others. And that is when, like Sara Cate said, it's a movable thing. You get to learn where you're more permeable for people to like come in, and you might not realize how easily they're let in until you get to the point where you're just like exhausted and can't do anymore. And that might be the thing that, hopefully we don't always go that far, but a lot of times it takes something to really rock us to be like, okay, I just can't do this anymore. But then we get to have that learning experience. And so the next time we're involved with something like that, we realize it sooner. We realize that we're moving further away from ourselves sooner, so that the boundaries can come in quicker and we don't have to go to that like bottom.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Like that level of like utter kind of destruction, or like, I am now so completely, utterly depleted that I have nothing left, right? Like that emptiness that can come from a lack of boundary.
Yeah.
And it's because and this is something, that's, I think, such an important conversation to have, is that like, it's not wrong if you don't set the boundary soon enough.
Exactly.
And it's not, you're not, there's no shame in that lack of awareness, because sometimes we have to hit the bottom to know exactly where it's like, and believe you me, I have face planted on the bottom multiple times, because I think I can do it. There's still that drive in me. There's still that impulse in me. There's still the performer in me that's like, I can do a little bit more. I can give a little bit more. I can push myself a little bit more. But then the only person that really suffers in that's not true. Because then what people are getting from me is also not the best and not what I want to give. And then I'm depleted also. So it's like, really no one wins in that scenario. And so hopefully, like, I have to hit the bottom less, but it doesn't mean I'm not going to.
Right.
And then I have to reorient to like, hold on, wait a minute, here I am again.
Yeah.
Right. And that just like, a couple of sessions ago, I think we just talked about things like becoming, like, it's exercising a new muscle.
Yes.
And so there's pain in that.
Yeah. And
we
there's
also, time in that.
I think it was last session when
we don't.
I don't know.
We talk a lot.
I'm pretty sure Sara Cate said this last session. It's not about never moving away from yourself, or never like either forgetting to set a boundary, or not realizing or not understanding the boundary that you need to set. It's about the return home. It's about the return to yourself. And then that's where the true like growth and the true love and trust comes from, is because you came back. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, then recognizing, like you were saying, like it gets a little bit easier, because it's like, oh, okay. So I see, if we can come at it with awareness, then we're coming at it with this sense of like, okay, what is the micro adjustment I need to make, rather than like the major macro adjustment I need to make. Like, hopefully then we just start like fine tuning and just minimally having to tweak, like, oh, okay, that's how I actually want to participate with this person, or this thing that I'm giving my time and energy to. And then I think it's, important to note, like, when we decide, or when we become aware that we have had a lack of boundaries, or we have not really practiced utilizing them, it can be very difficult when you are in established relationship to
Mhm.
then bring in boundaries. I
Mhm.
want to just name that, like, if you
Mhm.
are in a long-term partnership, or if a long-term friendships, familial relationships, like when we have historically not had boundaries in place, to then just bring them in and like completely rework the entire design of a relationship can be very disorienting and very disruptive. So, I want to just name that that if that is, it feels overwhelming to you, or it feels scary to you, or maybe it might even seem unsafe to start to put boundaries in place with people in our lives, like, know that you're not alone. And I just want to validate and acknowledge that, yeah, that's the case. Like, it's not one of these things where we miraculously wake up and be like, I'm going to be this like really self-supported person, and you get a boundary and you get a boundary and you get a boundary. Like, it isn't that easy.
No.
It isn't that simple. And there can be pushback. And that's where I kind of was noting the practice of this, because,
Mhm.
specifically in relationships that you've been in long term, or even with jobs or bosses, or new projects, to reestablish or to establish a boundary, there's gonna be some ruffling of feathers. And so to acknowledge, like, this isn't an easy thing, it's not a decision and then it's done. It takes time, and it could potentially take the renegotiation of a relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I always refer, especially if it's like, if it is like a long-term partnership or friendship or like family member relationship, it's like renegotiating the contract altogether.
Mhm.
And, like Sarah Kate said, it's pretty unrealistic to wake up and like hand them the new contract and say, here, sign this. This is what I'm doing moving forward. However, if you can make that micro adjustment, that's the start.
Mhm.
Like you practice, right?
Mhm.
And the hope is then that as you are renegotiating this contract with them, that it also allows for their personal growth to
Mm.
come through. Because I think, and this is where it can get really tricky, right? A boundary, and one of the ways that it can get dangerous is if you're trying to set a boundary that is ultimately just about controlling the person that you're in a relationship with,
Mhm.
which when we think about abuse, we think about like the blatant, physical, emotional, spiritual, sexual abuse, right? But creating boundaries in a way that is like purposeful only to control them, that's not what we're talking about here. And
Mhm.
that's not going to be beneficial for anybody. What is going to be beneficial is making those micro changes for yourself, because it will open up the space for them
Mhm.
to provide their sense of boundaries, right? Like if you're in a relationship, it's not one-sided. And we all know how those relationships work out, right? I think we have a culture, especially if you look around on the Insta world, or wherever you consume your social media needs. We get a lot of messages that it's like only about you, and it is only about your boundaries. And yes, for you, you are keeping yourself safe
Mhm.
and happy and healthy. That is the most important thing. However, we can't survive in a world where we only think about ourselves. It's
Mhm.
not going to work. And so when you're in relationship with others, here, this is why relationships are complicated, right? And this is why communication is so important. And this is why understanding that the person that you get in a relationship with, again, if it's your mom, if it's a friend, if it's a partner, whoever it is, you're not going to be in the same relationship with them as when you first started.
Mm.
We're not the same people as we were 3 weeks ago, or 3 years ago, or 30 years ago, right? And to expect them to be the same
Mhm.
is completely unfair. And we don't necessarily know how they're going to respond.
Mhm.
And it can be a really pleasant surprise to find out when you do start to practice some of these like micro changes and these like helping yourself stick to your boundaries. It can be really awesome sometimes to see how they just naturally respond to that. And it
Mhm.
can be such an empowering and healthy thing for the both of you.
Yeah.
It can also go the other way, of course, right? Because people, especially if people are used to you overexerting yourself, always saying yes, and now all of a sudden you say, no, actually, I can't do that, they're going to get upset because that's your purpose in their life, you know? And so we've talked about this already. Like, it doesn't always mean that it's going to be awesome. Leave that open, leave that possibility open, because people will surprise you a lot. But also then when it's those relationships, when it's the relationships, when this becomes really hard, it's real, it is really hard. That's when some support might be helpful as you navigate this, because it's going to test you and you're going to start to second guess yourself, because you're going to do what Sara Cate said, what she likes to do. What we all like to, well, I like to do this too. I'll be like, no, I can actually.
No, I can't.
I'll rearrange. Yeah, like, it doesn't matter. Like, I'll rearrange my schedule. I won't tell them that, but I'll, like, on the back end be like rearranging all of this stuff, or be like, one of the things that I do is I will just drive to wherever somebody needs me to be. And it's, people expect that now, because I'll be like, yeah, sure.
I'll come to you.
Yeah, I'll come to you. It's 45 minutes away. We could meet in the middle, but like, sure, I'll drive all the way down to see you at your house, you know? And then when I say, I've actually lost friendships because of this. When I say, you know what, I have this amount of time, I could meet you here halfway, doesn't work for them. Okay, cool. That's not something then that I want to participate in. It does not mean that it was easy, and it does not mean that I wasn't hurt and upset by it, but like, do I want to be in a relationship with somebody truly that, like, that's what I'm in their life for, to like bend over backwards for them? Absolutely not.
Right. Well, I think it shows you when you start to establish boundaries, you know, and to Ashley's point, let's be clear, boundaries are not for somebody else.
Right.
They are not for the person that you're setting them for. The boundary is for you.
Right.
The boundary is to protect you. So if you are putting a boundary on somebody else, check that. But if you're putting the boundary up and you get to protect your heart and your energy and your emotional experience on the backside, you know, notice who it's for.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what can save you from really over, you know, from potentially creating too much of a rigid structure for somebody else in a boundary. If, you know, if it's for you to help protect your time and your energy, and saying, hey, I have this much space, this is what I can do, you're going to notice really quickly who will respect your boundaries. And you'll notice really quickly who you'll need to have stronger boundaries with.
Yeah.
It really elucidates that quite hastily when you said it, because then they're like, I can't do that. And then you realize, wow, in this relationship, I've been the one. I've been the one to do this. And do I care about this person? Yes. Do I want this person in my life still? Sure. But here's what I have to give now. Now I will always communicate. Can we meet? Or this is how I can do it, or whatever it is. Like, if you start taking up space, right? Not self-abandoning, taking up the space and saying, here's what I can do. And somebody comes at it. A, you need that boundary.
Yeah.
And B, just recognize that, you know, and then there'll be other people who are like, wow, you're right. I can totally meet you halfway.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that. You know, some of my friends have even like, I mean, they've, you know, been like pounding at the door of my brain to like beat it into me I shouldn't say that, but like to really like beg me to name like needs that I have, right? Like the friends that are like wanting, they're there for me to learn how to set boundaries, where they're like, Sara, you don't have to say yes to this, or Sara, what can I do to help you have more access to asking me for help? Right? Like there are so many people that once you start to establish boundaries, or like I'll establish a boundary and they'll be like, look at that, you know, like they like cheer me on, like I've just done an Olympic event, but I just said no to something. But it is, you start to really recognize, and it helps kind of show you who's in that mutual reciprocity of connection and love, and like how you can respect and honor their boundaries more, and who really isn't, and who then you do need to establish, you know, specific boundaries with. Like I've lost It's not something I ever really thought would have happened to me in my life, but the same thing when I started setting boundaries around my time and energy, for some friends, it didn't work.
Yeah.
It didn't work if
Mhm.
I wasn't completely,
Mhm.
I wasn't showing up in every way, all of the time, 100% of the time.
Mhm.
And, there's still some pain in
Yeah.
because I do deal with the shame critic and the
Mhm.
self-judgment critic of like, well, had you just had more,
Yeah.
you
Totally.
could have kept that friendship.
Totally. And it's so one of the things that I just remember feeling was when I decided to or when I have decided to say things like that, knowing that I was taking up space was a really hard spot for me to be in
Mhm.
because again, they might not see it on the outside, but I would rearrange schedules or I would be like, yeah, sure, it doesn't matter. I've been up since 5 a.m. I will come to you at 8 p.m. and like be with you or like whatever it is, I didn't feel like I don't know if it was the right or I didn't feel worthy enough to take up this space.
Mhm.
But then when people recognize that you taking up space this isn't a selfish thing. This isn't like it's all about me thing. It's just existing as the worthy sovereign being that
Mhm.
you are. And when people recognize that and when people support you in that, gives you a new sense of hope of like, oh, there are my people out there.
Mhm.
And we're not for everybody. And that's okay.
Mm. Well, and I think like what we have to also name is that like the line between self-abandonment to not abandon the other
Mhm.
and abandoning the other to not self-abandon is hair thin,
Mhm.
right? Like it is the most nuanced, like minute discrepancy
Yeah.
of one little shift, right? And so we
Mhm.
have to be really careful with like where am I giving too much and where am I not giving enough, and what does that mean? How do we navigate that negotiation, right? Like
Mhm.
how do we find what works for us and also supports the other,
Yeah.
and finding where that is. And I don't, again, I don't think it's something that like we can put all of these, there's like all of these posts out there and books that are written on this stuff, and I think it's important to have those concepts, but the reality is when it's in practice, when it's actually in application, it is so much more muddy
Yeah.
and harder to discern,
Yeah.
because there are times where I do wish I had more to give. And
Mhm.
so there has to be a little bit
Mhm.
of grief in,
Mhm.
grief work, and like I can't show up the way that I want to. And I've had to start to name that some too of
Yeah.
like, I actually don't have, especially being a therapist and working with trauma all day. I'll get to the end of the day and, maybe a friend or somebody, a family member will want to connect. And I feel this guilt because I'm like, I literally don't have it. I
Yeah.
don't have the presence that I want to offer. And so I have to be honest about that. And there's just like some grief of like, man, I wish I had more and I don't.
Mhm.
And there could be a moment there where I say, hey, let's do voice memos back and forth instead of doing a phone call or something. Like I find a way to be able to show up for what's happening for them as I want to, because I love them and care about them, but also still protecting some of my energy and boundary, right? So like the boundary there maybe gets a little bit more, but to your point, permeable, where I'm not like, hey, I'll call you tomorrow, but I still engage a little bit where I find that like I can give this much in this way. I'm sorry, I can't give my full attention and presence. And that even is like helped me, I think, with the reception of my boundary by others, and like for even me with other people of like, hey, I can do this tomorrow, or hey, let's chat in this way. Like learning how to really work with just like the dynamic way we have to kind of sometimes set them, where it's like, no, we can't. Sometimes we don't have the choice to set a boundary.
Yeah.
Sometimes we just have to show up.
Yeah.
And then sometimes there's more spaciousness for us to be like, actually that can we do that next week?
Yeah.
You know,
Or not at all.
or not at all.
But
That's a good one.
but that's the practice.
Yeah.
That is the practice. Cause I still catch myself depending on what kind of mood I'm in, I'll be like, yeah. I'll be like, yes, sounds lovely, schedule it. And the day comes and I'm like, what the heck was I thinking? Because I know that it doesn't align with my true desires.
Mm-hmm.
But in that moment, they caught me and now I'm there. And sometimes it has to be like a backtrack of, you know what, this actually really doesn't, I was hoping it would, but this really doesn't work for me. Sometimes I've just had to follow through because it was kind of too late, you know, and I'm not going to leave somebody hanging. But depending on what it is, but that's the practice though, of now I know, like, okay, you might need a little more time, like stop saying yes so quickly, right? Like take a little time to think about it. That's one of my boundaries, is like, I have to take a step back and I have to let myself sit with it, because otherwise I would probably say yes to everything. Somebody be like, want to do this? Yeah, great. Let's go. You know, instead of being like, I don't know, do I actually want to do that? And that's a really good question to ask yourself with anything, in relationship, in job, in whatever it is like, do I actually really want to do that? Does that actually feel like something I want to move towards? And that can help you kind of start to discern, like, where are you doing more things that you don't want to do? Obviously, when you have a choice, right? So we mentioned like the mom-daughter relationship, really like mom-child relationship. And when a new baby is here, like your life is run by this little human schedule, and you kind of you have to search to find space for yourself a lot harder than you did pre-baby, right? And so like what we just spoke to is like, when you have the option to be more choosy about where you spend your time, practice it. When you don't have the option, that is where it becomes even more important to understand what is the purpose of this activity that I'm doing that I don't like. Because you're probably like, you might not like to clean the pump supplies all the time, and you might not like to do all of the laundry, and you might not like to also have to do the cooking, right? Like, but it's like you're giving, and then you get to the end of the day and you're like, great, now I'm going to be up 17 times to feed this baby, and there's nothing left. And so that is where, first of all, having support to help navigate those transitions is huge, and you deserve that. And there are people there to help you with that. And so don't confuse this with us saying like, oh, just set your boundaries. Like, what are you going to do? Not feed the baby? That's insane. So, but you 100% can, and I will say this forever, you 100% can find support. We just have to know that it's available, and we have to be brave enough to ask for the support.
Well, and I think in that to me goes so much wider than even just the mom conversation. I mean, sure. We know, like, I mean, I'm not a mother, so I can't speak to certain things, but I know, working with all women and those who identify as women, like, it is the most nurturing and overarching need to pour out. And so it's easy in that one to like let your boundaries, let your needs go to the wayside. So that's kind of the dynamic, the relationship that we can point to say, this is kind of, this helps us explain it a little bit more. And I think it does go much wider to ask for that help, to ask for that support, to recognize that like our boundaries are there for us to know where our limits are. And when we know where our limits are, then we know where we need support and help. Then we can start to advocate for needs in relationship, and advocate for agency in our workplace or in our professional environments or our personal environments. It doesn't really matter. And even like we kind of touched on, like the familial relationships where we've just been told biologically that we're not allowed to have boundaries with our family members, when that's in fact the last thing or the thing that should be the least true. Because sometimes those are the most difficult relationships that we navigate. And just because we're biologically connected does not mean that individuals get to cross our boundaries. So it really, and so we learn where those limits are, and we learn where to ask for help. And, you know, I mean, shit, it is like my least favorite thing to do. It's like, I would rather, oh my God. Like I would rather climb in a pit of spiders than ask for help. And it's it goes back to this like sense of worthiness and sense of value. And I think, that for anybody, for caregivers, for people in relationship, like if you've not been told that
Mhm.
you get to have needs, or that if your needs have not been acknowledged or validated, if historically you've been so independent and so self-reliant because you had to for survival, it is very hard to
Mhm.
set the boundary of even saying, I need in relationship for you to show up for me sometimes.
Yeah.
Right. And this can have a really strong impact on our
Mhm.
relationships, and not
Mhm.
having them or having them too much, like
Yeah.
it really is. And so being able to kind of discuss it and go into just to kind of name the somatic side of this work. Like I always say, when you're setting a boundary, where do you feel, number one, you need it to be in space? I like to use like physical spaciousness to kind of help people understand or set the ground rules for the boundary that they're going to put in place. So like for instance, I have a client who they have a really difficult dynamic with a parent. And so I asked, Ashley and I are in the tent space right now. And there's a wooden platform, and then there's a yard, and then there's a gate. So there's a long distance that we can place it. And I asked where they wanted to place their parent, and their parent was in the alley. Right? Their parent was way the hell out there. And so for them spatially, they were like, okay, I want to place them there. And I was like, and what kind of material does your body need to feel safe? Is it a screen door? Is it a concrete wall? Is it, like, how does that sensory, like that sensational aspect need
Mhm.
to work? Because there might be some people, like with me and Ashley, like I just picture like little sparkles between us, like
Totally.
little dancing sparkles. Like I
Totally.
don't my boundaries with her are very fluid
Mhm.
because because we do this work. And we're so respectful and mindful of the other, right? And we're safe with each other. There's an established level of trust here. But let's say, boundary with an old boss of mine. That boundary was so strong. It was a brick wall, and it was
Mhm.
100 yards away from me. Like I
Mhm.
wanted none of their energy to come near me at all, ever. And I had to work with them. So I had to imagine every time I was doing work with them, I had to imagine they were on the other side of that brick wall.
Yep.
Yes, I could still communicate with them, but
Yep.
I felt this physical spaciousness in my body where I felt protected. And then I also felt this block
Yeah.
too, right? So
Yep.
like learning how to like kind of play with the idea of like, where do I want to place them in
Mhm.
space, the person that I'm working with, and are there any other protective barriers between them and me that
Totally.
I need? And again, it can be fluid.
Yeah.
It can
I've
move.
also like, especially if I'm around people who are, or I have to be in closer vicinity with people if it's going to be like, like a family thing or something like that, or just a meeting with somebody where I know my boundaries are more permeable. I literally will picture myself kind of wearing an armor, and that armor serves that, like, okay, their input or their questions or their whatever they say can hit this armor, but it's like my reminder of like, nope, you have to think about what you want to say to this. Like,
Mm-hmm.
this is where you get to practice because you have this barrier that kind of hits it.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's something that I'm not okay with, I can let it bounce off, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
way for me to see that in my head. It's a way for me to work with it.
Mm-hmm.
Is it perfect? No. Does it help? 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, we've given like a couple different examples. You might find your own, but thinking about how can you visualize this, or how can you put these physical barriers
Mm-hmm.
in place to help with the non-physical feelings and
Mm-hmm.
sensations that you're getting? There you go. Like, start there, practice with that.
Mm-hmm. And practice, I always say, like, for instance, like I was using the example of Ashley and I, the way that I feel around Ashley energetically in my body is I feel, a settling in my belly and down my spine. Like I don't feel myself tensing. I'm not in constriction. I'm not like, protecting myself. And so I notice that when I'm around people who I feel really safe with, or are people I trust, I practice sensing that when I'm
Mhm.
with them, because it helps me also
Mhm.
then create a mental framework of like, oh yeah, in my body, I don't need a strong barrier or boundary with this person.
Yeah.
Because I can sense that I'm safe. Now, then there are other people, like when I worked with kids, we always called it the uh-oh feeling, where you would get the uh-oh feeling in your body of like, I don't really want to be around this person. Or you can just, even, it doesn't even have to be that they're dangerous. It can just be like personality types, right? Like there's something in their personality type that might be triggering for you from an old relationship or something along those lines. So if you just notice that kind of like that lift in your stomach or the constriction in your chest or this like rounding of your shoulders where you feel like you're closing off, notice that too, because those sensation perceptions can really help you understand where boundaries need to be put in place, because your brain might not perceive why this person isn't, you're not vibing with them. But if you energetically feel it in your body, if you start to notice, this is where we go back to that somatic conversation that we had, to start to track those things and say, when I'm around people I really trust and really feel great with, what do I notice in my body? Start there. Don't go with the ones that are like, bleh, bleh, whatever that is, but stay with the ones that are like, no, this person's really, I don't feel anything.
And just like, we talk about like practice using this muscle, that's how you get used to feeling that. And that's how you get your body used to accepting it. Because like we mentioned, if you are someone who just like gives and gives and gives, feeling like when I would have people say like, I'm going to drive to you, or you came here last time, I'm going to come to you this time, I would have to literally sit back and be like, oh, okay, I can accept this, because it felt so odd to me in relationships that it shouldn't feel odd in. I was like, you mean you want to come over? Like you want to help? You want to come? You want to show up? You're going to help? Like what? And so practicing letting yourself feel the good. Practice that, because it will fill you up and remind you of why you're even doing this work. And I think that is just, I don't know, maybe a really good place to like leave them is just practice feeling the good.
The resourced sensations, the sensations that just feel really grounded and comfortable in your body.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, if you need help in setting boundaries, I don't know that I'm your girl. Kidding.
It's just real.
It's just
hard,
real.
And it's up and down.
Hard. And so we are in it with you.
Yeah.
But truly, if you need any resources, we have them listed. Also, a really incredible resource really quickly is Pixie Lighthorse's Boundaries and Protection book. It's all about setting boundaries in different circumstances in your life. Really, really beautiful stuff. But other than that, we'll see you
next time.